The ground gave way beneath the backhoe's bucket, and Marcus Chen knew immediately that something was wrong with the way the earth swallowed the machine's weight. He killed the engine and climbed down, boots sinking into the New Mexico clay he'd been excavating for the past 2 hours. The septic system for his new house needed to go somewhere, and after 3 weeks of waiting for the contractor to return his calls, Marcus had decided to dig the leach field himself. He had the equipment, he had the permits, and he had enough construction experience from his Army Corps of Engineers service to know that septic installation wasn't rocket science. What he didn't have was patience for contractors who couldn't be bothered to show up. The hole he'd dug was 12 feet long, 4 feet wide, and supposed to be 6 feet deep. But where the backhoe bucket had broken through, the bottom had collapsed into what looked like a void. A hollow space beneath the hardpan that shouldn't exist according to every geological survey he'd reviewed before buying this property. Marcus grabbed his flashlight from the truck and approached the edge carefully, testing the ground's stability with each step. Beside him, keeping perfect pace as always, Scout moved with the alert focus that had made her exceptional at her military job and now made her an excellent ranch dog. The German Shepherd was 7 years old, 4 of those years spent working explosives detection in Afghanistan, where she and Marcus had been partners, and 3 more here in New Mexico, where she'd adapted to civilian life with the same competence she brought to everything. Her nose could find anything from tripwires to lost cattle, and right now she was telling Marcus through body language that the hole in the ground interested her beyond simple curiosity. Marcus knelt at the edge and shone his light down. The void extended at least 10 feet below the excavation floor, a chamber carved from the bedrock or formed by some geological process he couldn't immediately identify. The walls looked too regular to be natural, too smooth and precise, but the shadows made detailed assessment impossible from above. He'd need to go down there, check it out, figure out if this was a cave system that would complicate his septic plans or something else entirely. Scout barked once, sharp and insistent, her alert signal that meant she'd detected something worth his immediate attention. Marcus looked at her, then back at the hole, and made the decision that would change everything. "Stay, Scout. I'm going down to look." He retrieved rope and a harness from his truck, rigged an anchor point to the backhoe's frame, and descended into the void with his flashlight clenched between his teeth. The walls were definitely not natural formation. They'd been cut, shaped by tools or techniques that left surfaces smooth as polished stone. The chamber was roughly square, perhaps 12 feet on each side, and one wall showed an opening, a doorway or passage that led further into darkness. Marcus's boots touched the chamber floor, and he unclipped from the rope, playing his flashlight across walls that were covered in markings. Not random scratches or mineral deposits, but deliberate carvings, symbols and glyphs that looked ancient and purposeful. He moved closer, tracing one with his finger, and felt the hair rise on his neck. These weren't Native American petroglyphs like the ones he'd seen at Chaco Canyon or Bandelier. The style was different, more complex, with a formality that suggested writing rather than simple pictorial representation. The passage beckoned, and Marcus knew he should go back up. Call someone with archaeological expertise handle this discovery through proper channels. But curiosity pulled at him with the same insistence that had led him through countless doorways in Afghanistan when prudence suggested waiting for backup. He moved into the passage, following it as it descended at a gentle angle, the carved walls continuing their coverage of glyphs and symbols. After 30 feet, the passage opened into a much larger space, and Marcus stopped at the threshold, his flashlight beam inadequate to fully illuminate what lay beyond. He could see stairs, broad stone steps descending into a chamber that extended far beyond his light's reach. The air smelled different here, dry and mineral-rich, with an undertone of something organic, possibly decay or guano from bats that might use these spaces. But the temperature was cool and constant, the kind of climate-controlled environment that natural caves sometimes provided, but that seemed too perfect for random geology. He descended the stairs slowly, counting 30 steps before reaching a floor tiled in stone. His flashlight beam swept across the chamber, revealing walls covered entirely in carved reliefs, images of people and animals and symbols arranged in narrative sequences that suggested history or mythology or both. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, detailed and precise in ways that spoke to significant skill and resources. This wasn't simple cave art. This was sophisticated work by a culture with advanced stone-working capabilities. At the chamber's center stood a platform, raised about 3 feet above the floor, and on that platform sat objects that made Marcus's breath catch. Even from 20 feet away, even in flashlight illumination that cast more shadows than light, he could see these were artifacts of substantial value, pottery vessels painted in colors that should have faded centuries ago. Stone sculptures depicting human and animal forms with startling realism, and something that gleamed gold in the flashlight beam, a mask or ceremonial object that couldn't possibly be what it appeared to be. Marcus forced himself to stop, to override the impulse to move closer and examine these objects. He'd found something significant, something that required expert assessment and careful documentation. Touching anything, moving anything, could damage fragile materials or destroy contextual information that archaeologists would need to understand this site's history and meaning. The professional thing, the legal thing, was to leave everything exactly as he'd found it and get help. He took photographs with his phone, dozens of them from multiple angles, capturing the chamber and its contents as completely as limited light allowed. Then he backed away, retraced his path up the stairs and through the passage, and climbed the rope back to the surface where Scout waited with barely controlled anxiety. "It's okay, girl. I'm back." He scratched behind her ears, needing the familiar comfort of her solid presence after the strangeness of what he'd just seen. Then he pulled out his phone and started making calls. The first call went to the New Mexico Office of Archaeological Studies, where a recorded message informed him that office hours were 9 to 5 weekdays and he should leave a message for callback. He left a message that probably sounded crazy, but hit the key points: his name, his location, and that he'd discovered what appeared to be a significant archaeological site on his property and needed immediate assistance. The second call went to the county sheriff, because Marcus figured a discovery like this might have security implications, and he wanted official documentation of his initial report. The dispatcher sounded skeptical, but took his information and said a deputy would be sent to assess the situation. The third call went to his neighbor, Linda Vasquez, who'd lived in this area her whole life and worked as a curator at the New Mexico Museum of Natural History. If anyone could provide immediate context for what he'd found, it would be Linda. She answered on the second ring, her voice carrying the warmth that had made her an easy friend in the 3 months since Marcus had moved here. "Marcus, what's up?" "Linda, I need your expertise. I was digging for my septic system and broke through into some kind of underground chamber. It's covered in glyphs and carvings, and there are artifacts that look really old and possibly valuable. Can you come take a look?" Silence on the line. Then, "You're serious?" "Completely. I took photos, but I need someone who knows what they're looking at. Send me the photos, and don't touch anything else. If this is what you're describing, it could be incredibly significant." Marcus sent the best photos from his phone, a dozen images that captured the chamber and artifacts from various angles. He heard Linda's sharp intake of breath when the images came through. "Marcus, where exactly is your property?" "About 15 miles southeast of Socorro. Why?" "Because you're sitting on what used to be a major trade route between the Rio Grande Pueblos and Mesoamerican civilizations. The Pueblo people had contact with cultures from central Mexico, traded goods and probably ideas over hundreds of years. But we've never found direct evidence of Mesoamerican presence this far north, until maybe now." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying those glyphs in your photos look Mayan. Not Pueblo, not Apache, not any southwestern culture I recognize. Mayan. Which should be impossible, because Mayan territory was centered in the Yucatan and Guatemala, not New Mexico. But if someone from that culture traveled north and built something here, this could rewrite what we know about pre-Columbian trade and cultural exchange." Marcus looked at the hole in his backyard, at Scout sitting patiently beside the excavation, at the ordinary New Mexico landscape that had just revealed itself to contain extraordinary secrets. "How soon can you get here?" 30 minutes. Don't let anyone else down there until I've assessed the site. And Marcus, if those artifacts are what they appear to be, you've just made one of the most important archaeological discoveries in the Southwest. This is going to change everything." The call ended, and Marcus stood in his backyard trying to process Linda's words and their implications. He'd bought this property because it was affordable and isolated, 5 acres of high desert scrubland with decent well water and enough distance from neighbors to satisfy his preference for solitude. The house was small and needed work, but it was his, purchased with his discharge pay and a VA loan after 6 years in the Army Corps of Engineers. He'd planned to spend his post-service years raising a few head of cattle, maybe some chickens, living quietly while he figured out what came next, after the structure and purpose of military life. Finding a Mayan pyramid in his backyard had not been part of that plan. A sheriff's deputy arrived 20 minutes later, a young man named Rodriguez, who looked at the hole and the rope, and Marcus's description of what lay below with clear skepticism. "You're saying there's some kind of underground temple down there?" "I'm saying there's a chamber with carved walls and artifacts that need professional assessment. I've called the State Archaeological Office and a museum curator. They're on their way." "And you didn't touch anything?" "Took photos, that's it." Rodriguez peered into the hole, shining his own flashlight down. "Huh. Well, I'll stay until your experts arrive. Make sure nobody disturbs the scene. If this is legitimate, it'll probably become a protected site pretty quick." "What does that mean for my septic system?" "Means you're probably not installing it here. Archaeological sites take priority over private development once they're documented and registered." Marcus absorbed that information with mixed feelings. He needed the septic system to make his house livable long-term, but he also understood the importance of protecting significant historical finds. If what he'd discovered was genuinely important, his convenience became secondary to preservation and study. That was how things should work, even when it complicated his personal plans. Linda arrived exactly 30 minutes after their call, driving a battered Subaru that looked like it had seen hard use on New Mexico's rough roads. She climbed out carrying a large backpack and moved toward the excavation with focused energy. Marcus had known Linda was in her early 50s and experienced, but seeing her in professional mode reinforced just how seriously she took this. "Show me," she said without preamble. Marcus led her to the edge, and she spent 5 minutes examining the hole and the exposed chamber walls from above before turning to him. "I'm going down. You have another harness?" "In the truck." They geared up together, Marcus appreciating how efficiently Linda moved through the preparation. She'd clearly done this kind of field work many times, knew the safety protocols and equipment needs. They descended together, Marcus going first to guide the way, and when they reached the chamber floor, Linda gasped. "Oh my God." "Marcus, these are definitely Mayan glyphs. Late Classic period if I'm reading the style correctly, which puts them between 600 and 900 AD. This shouldn't exist. Mayans didn't build in New Mexico, but here it is." She moved along the walls, examining glyphs with a small LED headlamp that provided better illumination than Marcus's flashlight. Her hands traced carvings, but didn't touch them directly, maintaining the professional distance that protected fragile materials. She took her own photographs, hundreds of them, capturing details Marcus had missed in his initial exploration. When they reached the passage leading to the larger chamber, Linda paused. "You went down there?" "Yeah." "That's where the artifacts are. Show me, but slowly. I need to document everything in sequence." The descent took 30 minutes this time, Linda stopping every few feet to photograph and sketch glyphs that lined the passage walls. She muttered observations into a digital recorder, technical descriptions that meant little to Marcus, but clearly mattered to her professional assessment. When they finally reached the main chamber, Linda stood at the bottom of the stairs for a full minute without speaking, her light sweeping across the space in slow arcs. "This is a tomb," she said finally, "or possibly a temple, though the configuration suggests funerary purpose. The platform at the center would hold offerings, and those artifacts are burial goods, items meant to accompany someone important into the afterlife. Who? No way to know without more analysis, but the quantity and quality of the goods suggests high status. Nobility or priesthood, someone whose death merited significant resources and elaborate ritual." They approached the platform together, and Linda's assessment of the artifacts made Marcus realize he'd barely scratched the surface of understanding what he'd found. The gold mask was only one piece among dozens. There were jade carvings, ceramic vessels painted with scenes depicting ceremonies and battles, stone sculptures that showed remarkable anatomical detail, even what looked like books, folded bark paper covered in glyphs and protected by stone cases that had preserved them for over 1,000 years. "Linda, what's all this worth?" She looked at him sharply. "In monetary terms, impossible to say. Each artifact would need individual assessment, but collectively, if these are authentic and in the condition they appear to be, you're looking at pieces that museums and collectors would pay enormous sums to acquire. Tens of millions, easily, possibly much more depending on what the glyphs reveal about historical connections and cultural exchange. Tens of millions, at minimum. But Marcus, you need to understand something crucial. These artifacts don't belong to you legally. Under federal and state law, archaeological materials found on private land have complicated ownership status, especially if they're Native American or pre-Columbian. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act might apply. The Archaeological Resources Protection Act definitely applies. You can't sell these, can't remove them, can't do anything but report the find and cooperate with official investigation. Marcus felt something deflate in his chest, though he wasn't sure if it was disappointment or relief. So what happens now? Now we document everything thoroughly, secure the site, and bring in experts from the state and possibly federal level. This will become a protected archaeological site, and the investigation will probably take years. Your property will be subject to restrictions and oversight during that process. And the artifacts will eventually go to museums or possibly be repatriated to descendant communities if connections can be established. But Marcus, what you've discovered here is worth far more than money. This site could fundamentally change our understanding of pre-Columbian North America, prove that cultural connections between Mesoamerica and the Southwest were more extensive and sophisticated than we ever imagined. You've contributed to human knowledge in ways that transcend any monetary value. He wanted to believe that, wanted to feel the pride and satisfaction her words implied he should feel. But standing in an underground chamber filled with artifacts worth tens of millions of dollars that he'd discovered on his own property, but couldn't keep or profit from, Marcus felt mostly overwhelmed by the complications this would bring to his life. They spent another hour in the chamber, Linda documenting everything while Marcus held lights and occasionally assisted with measurements. Then they ascended back to the surface, where Deputy Rodriguez had been joined by 2 more sheriff's vehicles and a van from the State Archaeological Office. Word had apparently spread faster than Linda's 30-minute drive time, and now Marcus's quiet property was becoming a scene of official activity. The next hours passed in a blur of statements and documentation, experts arriving to make initial assessments, and the gradual realization that Marcus's discovery was even more significant than Linda's first reaction had suggested. By evening, his backyard held a dozen vehicles and 20 people, all focused on the hole in the ground that had started as a septic excavation and revealed itself to contain one of the most important archaeological finds in the Southwest's recorded history. A woman named Dr. Sarah Winters arrived from the University of New Mexico, carrying credentials that identified her as a professor of Mesoamerican archaeology and an authority on Maya civilization. She was perhaps 60, with silver hair and the kind of weathered face that suggested decades of fieldwork in challenging conditions. She examined Linda's photos on a tablet, then looked at Marcus with an expression that mixed excitement and something approaching reverence. "Mr. Chen, do you understand what you found? Linda says it's a Mayan tomb or temple, that it shouldn't exist this far north. That's correct on both counts, but it's more than that. Based on preliminary glyph analysis, this appears to be associated with a Mayan nobleman, or possibly a royal who traveled north, probably as part of a diplomatic or trade mission, and died here. The glyphs reference events we've seen recorded in codices from the Yucatan, suggesting this person was significant enough that their death was noted in official histories. When did they die? The glyphs include calendar notations that we can correlate with our dating system. Preliminary reading suggests approximately 750 AD, plus or minus a few years. Marcus tried to wrap his mind around that time frame. So this has been here, under my backyard, for 1,250 years. Approximately, yes, sealed and forgotten until your backhoe broke through. It's remarkable that the chamber remained intact, that looting or natural processes didn't compromise it over more than a millennium. What happens now? Now we begin the most careful and extensive archaeological investigation this state has probably ever seen. We'll need to excavate properly, document everything in meticulous detail, analyze the artifacts using every tool modern science can provide. It's going to take years, possibly a decade or more, depending on what we find as we expand the investigation. And I just have to accept that my property will be an archaeological site for the next decade. Dr. Winters smiled gently. I understand this is disruptive to your plans, but Mr. Chen, you've made a discovery that will be studied for generations, that will appear in textbooks and museum exhibits and academic papers for the rest of human history. That's not small compensation for some inconvenience. Marcus wanted to point out that some inconvenience was a significant understatement when he still needed to install a septic system and now had no idea when or where that would be possible. But he also understood that arguing would be pointless. This was bigger than his personal needs, and fighting it would only make him look petty or greedy. If you've ever stumbled onto something that changed your life in ways you never wanted or expected, maybe you'd understand what Marcus felt standing in his backyard that evening, watching the sun set over a landscape that had hidden its secrets until the wrong moment and the right equipment revealed them. The site was secured overnight with tarps and temporary fencing, guards posted to prevent unauthorized access, and Marcus was given strict instructions not to discuss his discovery publicly until official announcements could be coordinated. He spent that night in his house with Scout, both of them unsettled by the sudden transformation of their property from private land into public interest. The next morning brought more officials, more equipment, and the beginning of what Dr. Winters called Phase 1, initial assessment and documentation. A tent structure was erected over the excavation site, and a team of graduate students began the painstaking process of mapping and photographing everything before any artifacts were moved. Marcus was allowed to observe but not participate, his role reduced to witness despite being the property owner. Linda stopped by mid-morning with coffee and sympathy. "How are you holding up?" "Honestly, I'm not sure. This is incredible and important, and I understand why everyone's excited. But I bought this place to have privacy and control over my own space. Now I've got a circus in my backyard and no idea when it ends." "It's going to be rough," she acknowledged. "But Marcus, once the initial documentation is done, the site will be more stable. They'll establish a work schedule, probably limit personnel to necessary researchers, and your life will return to something approaching normal. Just with archaeologists in your yard instead of cattle. That's not as comforting as you probably think it is," she laughed. "No, I suppose not. But look, there's another aspect you should consider. This discovery is going to bring attention, and some of that attention will involve people who want to claim those artifacts for themselves. You need to think about security, about protecting yourself and this site from treasure hunters or collectors who don't care about archaeological significance. You think people would try to steal from a secured archaeological site? I think artifacts worth tens of millions of dollars create incentives for people to take risks, and not everyone will believe the official story about what's down there. Some folks will think the estimates are conservative, that there's more treasure than anyone's admitting. You should probably upgrade your security, maybe talk to the state about providing official protection beyond what they're already doing." Marcus absorbed that advice with growing concern. He'd dealt with security threats in Afghanistan, understood how valuable resources attracted dangerous attention, but he'd hoped that kind of risk stayed overseas. Apparently not. "I'll talk to the sheriff, see what they recommend." Linda left, and Marcus spent the rest of the day alternating between watching the archaeological team work and handling the steady stream of calls from reporters who'd somehow gotten his number, despite official attempts to keep his identity confidential. He declined all interview requests, referred questions to Dr. Winters' office, and generally tried to minimize his public exposure, until he better understood what being the discoverer of a major archaeological site would mean for his life. That evening, after the team had left for the day and only the security guard remained to watch the site, Marcus descended into the chamber one more time. He needed to see it again, to confirm that what he'd found was real and not some stress-induced hallucination brought on by too much change, too fast. The artifacts sat exactly as they had during his first visit, beautiful and ancient and valuable, beyond anything he'd ever possessed. He thought about Dr. Winters' explanation that he couldn't keep any of this, that laws existed specifically to prevent private individuals from profiting off archaeological discoveries. Part of him understood the reasoning, the public interest in preserving and studying materials that belonged to human heritage rather than individual ownership. But another part felt the unfairness of finding something on his own land, through his own effort, and being told he had no right to benefit from it. Scout had followed him down, and she now sat beside him on the chamber floor, her presence steady and non-judgmental. He scratched behind her ears and spoke into the silence. "What do you think, girl? Did I make the biggest mistake of my life buying this property?" or the best decision. She huffed, her version of commentary when he asked questions she couldn't answer, and Marcus smiled despite his complicated feelings. Scout didn't care about artifacts or money or archaeological significance. She cared about being with him, having work to do, and the routines that structured her days. In that way, she was smarter than he was, focused on what mattered rather than getting lost in abstractions and what-ifs. He climbed back to the surface as the last daylight faded, secured the chamber access as instructed, and returned to his house where he made dinner and tried to pretend his life was still normal. But the presence of the guard vehicle in his driveway and the tent structure visible through his kitchen window made normalcy impossible. He'd crossed a threshold, and there was no going back to the simple ranching life he'd planned. The next weeks established a rhythm, if not exactly routine. The archaeological team worked 6 days a week, carefully excavating and documenting the chamber and its contents. They discovered that the structure extended beyond the initial chamber Marcus had found, that what he'd uncovered was actually the entrance to a more extensive complex. Additional passages led to more rooms, some empty, but others containing additional artifacts and glyphs that suggested this site had served multiple functions over time. Dr. Winters briefed Marcus regularly on their findings, partly because he was the property owner, and partly because she seemed to recognize his genuine interest, despite his frustration with the disruption. The glyphs told a story, she explained, about a Mayan noble named Kinich Yaxcucmo, who had traveled north with a diplomatic mission, seeking alliance with the Pueblo peoples against common enemies. He died during the journey, possibly from disease or injury, and his retinue had buried him here with full honors, creating a tomb that matched what would have been built in his homeland. The artifacts are burial goods, Dr. Winters explained one afternoon while they stood at the excavation's edge. Things he would need in the afterlife according to Mayan beliefs. The gold mask represents his divine connection, the jade carvings are protection against evil, the ceramic vessels contain food and drink for his journey. Everything here was chosen for spiritual significance, not just material value. But they do have material value, Marcus said. Enormous value, yes. We've had preliminary appraisals done by experts in Mesoamerican art. Conservative estimates put the collection's worth at $200 million if it were sold legally, which it can't be. Some pieces might be worth that much individually if they went to auction. 200 million. The number was so large it almost lost meaning. Marcus tried to imagine what he could do with that kind of money, and couldn't get past the simple fact that it would solve every financial concern he'd ever had or likely would have. And it was sitting in his backyard, legally untouchable, protected by laws designed to prevent exactly the kind of thinking he was engaging in. "You're thinking about the money," Dr. Winters observed. "Hard not to. I understand. But Marcus, let me tell you something. I've spent 40 years studying Mayan civilization, traveled throughout Mexico and Central America, examining ruins and artifacts, dedicated my entire career to understanding these people and their culture. And I've never seen anything like this. The preservation is extraordinary, the artifact quality is museum grade, and the historical significance exceeds anything I've worked on. You gave that to the world. That's worth more than money. That's easy to say when you have tenure and a salary." "Fair point," she acknowledged. "But consider this. If you'd found this site and tried to exploit it privately, sell the artifacts on the black market or to collectors, you'd be committing serious federal crimes. The penalties include prison time, massive fines, and criminal record that would follow you forever. Not to mention the moral dimension of destroying archaeological context for personal gain. By doing the right thing, reporting the discovery and cooperating with investigation, you've protected yourself legally and preserved something irreplaceable for future generations." Marcus knew she was right, but the knowing didn't make his situation feel less frustrating. He'd found treasure, real literal treasure worth hundreds of millions, and the best he could hope for was avoiding criminal prosecution and maybe some positive publicity. It felt like the universe's idea of a bad joke. The situation got more complicated when a law firm contacted him 6 weeks after the discovery, representing themselves as specialists in cultural property law and suggesting Marcus might have legal options he hadn't considered. The lawyer, a smooth-talking man named Richard Hartman, drove out from Albuquerque to make his pitch in person. "Mr. Chen, you're being told you have no claim to the artifacts you discovered, but that's not entirely accurate. The law in this area is complex and frequently contested. There are precedents for finders retaining ownership, or at least receiving significant compensation for discoveries made on private land. We specialize in these cases and have won substantial settlements for our clients. Marcus listened to the pitch with growing skepticism. Dr. Winters said the laws are pretty clear about archaeological materials. Dr. Winters represents the academic establishment that benefits from free access to discoveries like yours. They have incentive to discourage you from asserting your legal rights. But the Archaeological Resources Protection Act has exceptions and ambiguities that skilled representation can exploit. We've negotiated deals where finders received millions in compensation, retained rights to some artifacts, or secured other benefits the state initially claimed were impossible. And you'd take what, a third of anything you win? 40% is our standard contingency fee for cases of this complexity, but consider what 60% of even a modest settlement would mean for your financial security. We're talking generational wealth, Mr. Chen, the chance to never worry about money again. Marcus showed Hartman to the door with polite refusal, but the conversation gnawed at him over the following days. What if there were legal options he was missing? What if the state was taking advantage of his ignorance to claim artifacts that rightfully belonged to him? The questions created doubt that made sleeping difficult, and days feel conflicted. He discussed it with Linda over coffee at her house, needing perspective from someone he trusted. She listened to his summary of Hartman's pitch, then shook her head firmly. Marcus, those lawyers are vultures. They make money by creating conflict and dragging out legal battles that cost everyone time and resources. Yes, there are occasionally cases where finders receive compensation, but those are exceptions based on specific circumstances that don't apply here. This is a clear archaeological site with artifacts protected under federal law. Fighting that will cost you money you probably don't have, time you could spend moving on with your life, and reputation you need to maintain in this community. So I should just accept that I get nothing? You get to be the person who made one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in North American history. That's not nothing. And Marcus, realistically, even if you hired Hartman and somehow won some compensation, it would be a tiny fraction of the artifact's worth after legal fees and taxes. You'd spend years in litigation for what might end up being less than you'd make just selling your story to a documentary producer or writing a book about the experience. That perspective helped, grounded Marcus back in reality, and reminded him that chasing unlikely payouts often cost more than they returned. He declined Hartman's follow-up calls and focused instead on cooperating with the archaeological team and trying to maintain some normalcy in his life. But normalcy proved elusive. The discovery became public knowledge after official announcements, and suddenly, Marcus's property was marked on maps, mentioned in news articles, and attracting attention from people whose interest ranged from legitimate curiosity to something more concerning. Twice he caught people trying to access the site at night, amateur treasure hunters who'd apparently decided official security wasn't enough deterrent. Both times, scouts barking alerted him, and the sheriff's response scared off the intruders before they could reach the excavation. The third time was different. Marcus woke to scouts' urgent barking around 2 a.m. and looked out to see 3 figures near the tent structure, moving with purpose that suggested they weren't casual trespassers. He called 911 while pulling on clothes, but by the time deputies arrived 15 minutes later, the intruders had vanished and the tent had been damaged, its entrance flap cut open and some equipment disturbed. Dr. Winters arrived at dawn, looking shaken when she assessed the damage. They didn't get into the chamber, thank God. The security grating we installed held. But Marcus, this is going to keep happening. The more publicity this site gets, the more people will try to access it. We need better security, and you need to think seriously about your own safety. What do you suggest? The state can provide additional security personnel, but there are also private companies that specialize in protecting archaeological sites from looters. They're expensive, but given the site's value, it's probably justified, and you might want to consider staying somewhere else until we've completed the main excavation and concealed the site properly. You want me to leave my own property? I want you to be safe. People attempting to access this site might see you as an obstacle to remove. I'm not trying to scare you, but you need to understand the risks. Marcus considered her words while watching Scout patrol the fence line. doing her job with the same focus she'd brought to detecting explosives in Afghanistan. Leaving felt like surrender, like letting treasure hunters and criminals control his life. But staying meant accepting risks he couldn't fully mitigate on his own. The decision weighed on him. He chose to stay but upgraded security significantly. The state provided funding for a professional security company that installed motion sensors, cameras, and regular patrol personnel. His property began to feel more like a military installation than a ranch, with checkpoints and protocols and constant monitoring. It was invasive and uncomfortable, but necessary given the circumstances. The excavation continued through summer and into fall, each week revealing new aspects of the site. They found additional chambers, more artifacts and glyphs that expanded the historical narrative. Kiinich Yaks Kuk Mo had been even more significant than initial assessment suggested, a noble whose death had prompted his retinue to create something that honored his status while also serving as a lasting monument to Mayan presence in the far north. It was a bridge between cultures, a physical manifestation of connections that most scholars had believed were limited to indirect trade. Dr. Winters prepared papers for publication in major archaeological journals, and the site was featured in a lengthy article in National Geographic that included photographs of the artifacts and interviews with the research team. Marcus was mentioned but not featured prominently, his preference for privacy respected by journalists who understood he'd already dealt with more attention than he wanted. By November, the main excavation phase was complete, and discussion turned to long-term preservation and display plans. The artifacts would eventually go to museums, most likely split between New Mexico institutions and possibly some shared custody with Mexican museums given the item's cultural origin. The site itself would be preserved as a protected archaeological location, possibly open to limited public access once proper facilities could be built. And Marcus's septic system? That would need to be installed on a different part of his property, far from the archaeological zone now designated as historically significant. The added cost and complication annoyed him, but he'd accepted months ago that convenience had become secondary to preservation. What surprised him was the compensation package the state eventually offered. Not payment for the artifacts themselves, which remained protected under federal law, but compensation for the ongoing use of his property, for the disruption to his plans, and for his cooperation throughout the investigation. The amount wasn't anywhere near the artifact's value, but it was substantial enough to fund the ranch improvements he'd planned and provide financial cushion he hadn't expected. "It's not treasure," Linda said when he showed her the offer, "but it's recognition that you gave up something valuable by doing the right thing. Take it, Marcus. You've earned it." He took it, and the money arrived in his account 3 weeks later, enough to finish his house renovations, install the septic system in its new location, and build a barn for the cattle operation he still hoped to start. The archaeological site remained in his backyard, now properly secured and managed, and he'd adjusted to its presence the way people adjust to any permanent change in their circumstances. One afternoon in December, almost a year after his backhoe had broken through into the chamber, Marcus stood at the fence overlooking the excavation and thought about everything that had happened. The discovery, the investigation, the complications and opportunities, and ways his life had changed course without his choosing. It hadn't been what he'd planned, hadn't matched the quiet ranching life he'd imagined when buying this property. But it had become his story, the thing that would define how people remembered him and what he'd contributed to the world. Dr. Winters joined him at the fence, hands wrapped around a coffee mug against the December cold. "The preliminary papers are being very well received. Multiple institutions want to send researchers to study the site, and we're already getting funding commitments for Phase 2 excavation. This is going to keep producing discoveries for years, Marcus. I know, it's amazing, just not quite what I signed up for." "Rarely is," she agreed, "but you handled it well, better than many people would have. You could have tried to exploit this, could have made decisions that benefited you at the expense of history. Instead, you did the right thing at every turn. That matters. Does it? Sometimes I think I was just too intimidated by the laws to consider alternatives. Whatever the motivation, the outcome is what counts. Future generations will study this site and learn things about pre-Columbian America that we can only begin to imagine. That's your legacy, whether you wanted it or not." She left, and Marcus remained at the fence with Scout pressed against his leg. The winter sun painted the excavation in shades of gold and amber, and he could see the tent structure that now protected the entrance, the paths worn by researchers, the signs marking areas for restricted access. His backyard had become something larger than his personal space, and he'd had to learn to share it with history. He thought about the artifacts, about the gold mask and jade carvings and ceramic vessels that were now being prepared for museum display. $200 million worth of treasure that he'd found but couldn't keep. Wealth that would benefit institutions and scholars, but would never fill his personal bank account. The unfairness of it still stung sometimes, in quiet moments when he calculated what that money could have meant for his future. But there was also something else, something harder to articulate but real nonetheless. Pride, maybe, or satisfaction that he'd been part of something important. He'd found something lost for 12 centuries and brought it back to light. He'd contributed to human knowledge in ways that would outlast his own life, and while that contribution didn't pay his bills directly, it gave his existence meaning that extended beyond personal accumulation. Scout nuzzled his hand, her signal that she was ready to go inside, and Marcus obliged. They walked back to the house together, partner and friend, witnesses to the strange way life could surprise you when you were just trying to install a septic system. The story would be told for years, probably for generations, about the veteran who found a Mayan pyramid in his New Mexico backyard and chose preservation over profit. Whether that made him wise or foolish would depend on who was telling it. But Marcus knew which version he believed. He'd done the right thing, whatever the cost, and in the quiet of his own conscience, in the steady presence of his dog, and the knowledge that history would remember him well, he found a kind of peace that money couldn't buy. It wasn't the ending he'd imagined when he bought this property, but it was the ending he'd earned through choices made in moments when the path wasn't clear and the stakes were higher than he'd understood. The winter settled over New Mexico, bringing snow that covered the excavation and temporarily halted research. The site would wait under its white blanket, patient as it had been patient for centuries, ready to reveal its secrets when spring returned and work could resume. And Marcus would wait too, tending his property, planning his ranch, living the life he'd built on land that held more history than he'd ever imagined when the real estate agent first showed him the listing. If you found something in this story that resonated with your own experience of unexpected discoveries and difficult choices, maybe you'd share it with someone who needs to know that doing the right thing sometimes costs more than you want to pay, but delivers rewards that money can't measure. Years passed, as years do, and the site's significance only grew. Additional excavations revealed more chambers, more artifacts, and evidence of sustained contact between Mayan traders and Pueblo peoples that rewrote major sections of pre-Columbian American history. Marcus's property became a destination for researchers from around the world, and he grew comfortable with his role as caretaker and facilitator of their work. He never married, never had children, but he had his ranch and his cattle and Scout growing old beside him. The dog aged gracefully, her muzzle going entirely white, her pace slowing until long walks became short ones, and then just sitting together in the evening sun. She'd been with him through everything, from Afghanistan to this strange New Mexico adventure, and her presence had been the constant that let him navigate all the chaos. When Scout passed, quietly in her sleep, on a spring morning 12 years after they'd found the site, Marcus buried her on the hill overlooking the excavation. He marked the grave with a stone carved by a local artist, simple inscription, Scout, partner, friend. It felt insufficient for a life that had meant so much, but all memorials are insufficient when they try to capture the depth of genuine bond. Marcus continued his work, older now and weathered by the years, but still present and engaged with the ongoing research. Dr. Winters retired eventually, replaced by younger scholars who brought new techniques and perspectives, and the site yielded its secrets slowly to each generation of researchers. Marcus became something of a fixture, the old veteran who'd made the discovery and stayed to watch its unfolding, his presence a link to the moment when accident revealed wonder. On quiet evenings, he'd sometimes walk out to the excavation and remember that morning when his backhoe had broken through, when Scout had alerted and he'd descended into darkness to find treasure beyond any reasonable expectation. The memory was vivid even decades later, preserved in the kind of detail that marked truly transformative experiences. He'd been 43 then, still relatively young, still figuring out what his post-service life would be. Now he was past 70, and the life he'd built had been shaped entirely by what lay beneath his backyard. He never regretted the choices he'd made, the decision to report rather than exploit, to preserve rather than profit. The compensation had been adequate, the recognition meaningful, and the knowledge that he'd contributed something lasting to human understanding provided satisfaction that deepened with age. Money would have been spent or lost or tied up in complications he couldn't predict. What he'd gained instead was story, legacy, and purpose that transcended personal accumulation. The archaeological site continued its work long after Marcus was gone, passed eventually to new ownership, through arrangements that ensured its protection in perpetuity. The artifacts found homes in museums, where millions of visitors saw them and learned about the connections between ancient peoples, separated by vast distances but united by shared humanity. And in the academic papers and museum placards and documentaries that featured the site, Marcus Chen's name appeared always, the discoverer whose integrity matched his luck, because that was the truth of it, the lesson that outlasted the excitement of discovery and the complicated years that followed. Finding treasure meant less than what you did with it, and sometimes the greatest fortune came not from keeping what you found, but from giving it away. Marcus learned that truth the hard way, through frustration and temptation, and the steady weight of choosing principles over profit. But he learned it thoroughly, carried it through all his days, and passed it on to anyone who asked about that morning when his septic excavation revealed a pyramid. The story became legend in New Mexico, the veteran and his dog who found 200 million in Mayan treasure and chose to preserve it for the world. Teachers told it to students, parents told it to children, and each telling reinforced the idea that some things mattered more than money. Whether people believed it, whether they'd make the same choice if faced with similar circumstances, varied. But the story endured, and that was enough. Marcus had been given a chance to be part of something larger than himself, and he'd taken it. The cost had been high in some ways, the loss of privacy and simple plans, and the treasure that might have made him wealthy beyond imagination. But the gain had been higher, measured not in dollars but in meaning, in knowing his life had contributed to the great accumulated knowledge of human civilization. That was treasure of a different kind, immune to theft or devaluation, permanent as the carved stone that preserved Kinichyaksukmo's name for centuries. And on cold New Mexico nights when the wind howled across the high desert and the stars burned overhead in crystalline clarity, you could almost imagine the Mayan nobleman's spirit still present in the chambers beneath the earth, satisfied that his final resting place had been found and honored, that his journey north had not been forgotten, that his death in a strange land far from home had been marked by burial that matched his status and preserved his memory for far longer than he could have lived. The pyramid stood silent beneath the soil, patient as only stone can be patient, waiting for the next generation of researchers and the discoveries they would make. And the land held its secrets still, because Marcus's excavation had revealed one site, but surely not all of them. New Mexico was vast, its history deep, and who knew what other treasures waited beneath the surface, ready to surprise some future builder or rancher or curious veteran with a backhoe. The world was full of mysteries, and some of them were worth more than money could measure. Marcus Chen had learned that truth the hardest way possible, by finding fortune and giving it up, by choosing principle when profit beckoned, by doing the right thing when every instinct screamed to do otherwise. That choice defined him, shaped his legacy, and ensured that when people told his story, they told it with respect for the man who'd found treasure and had the wisdom to understand what was truly valuable. The sun set over the excavation site, painting the landscape in shades that had been ancient when Kinichyaksukmo traveled north, and would remain ancient when the last person who remembered Marcus Chen's name had passed. And in that continuity, that vast sweep of time that reduced individual lives to moments and personal fortunes to footnotes, perhaps there was the greatest treasure of all, knowing you'd been part of something that mattered, that endured, that connected past and future through the fragile present, where humans lived and chose, and sometimes, if they were very lucky, found something worth preserving for everyone who came after. The stars emerged overhead, the same stars that had guided Mayan astronomers and would guide whoever looked up next, and the story continued its patient unfolding through years and generations, proof that some discoveries change everything, and some changes are worth the cost they demand.